class, we will continue with Module 1, Business in a Changing World. This module concludes with Chapter 3, Business in a Borderless World. Our learning objectives include exploring some factors within the international trade environment. Again, we have talked about how businesses have changed over the decades, and one of the biggest changes has been internet and the availability of technology to reach a broader demographic. That being done, many individual companies have never considered or contemplated the shift from within their national borders to the international arena. But with technology being advanced and moving into the international space much more easy, um, this is a very, very major topic, and it's something that I think is important for all of us as consumers as well as potential business owners. We're going to investigate some economic and legal, political, social technology barriers to international business, and that's really taking your operations and moving it or expanding it to a different location outside of your nation's borders, which has a lot of implications. We're going to talk about allowances and agreements that encourage international trade. We're going to talk about the different levels of organizational involvement in international trade, and we will be contrasting basic strategies used in international business. And you can think of many organizations that are um, not a non-U.S. organization, but you can also notice there are U.S. organizations that are being traded or are conducting business outside of the United States. So this particular topic is quite relevant and I think will be useful for you. The international business is really the same process we do within our borders. It's just taking that same philosophy and translate it to a different culture, a different nation. So it's buying, selling, trading of goods and services outside your nation. And right now, where our nation is United States, so anything outside of the United States and its territories is going to be considered international business. Two-thirds of the total population purchasing power is outside the U.S. So we've got to consider the importance of international trade. Global marketing requires some kind of global brand, which means that there's going to be some type of assessment, a marketing assessment of your demographic, and it's going to be a little bit more complex simply because the nation and its political and religious and other customs are very foreign to your nation. But we'll have to understand that we have a lot of interaction in China and in other nations, um, and it's a good thing for many reasons. It does expand our knowledge base. It expands our economics. It makes it so that our economy can grow. Now, they are talking about three different types of advantages that are quite unique. Monopoly, we talked about that, but in an absolute advantage, this country has the only source of this item and the most efficient way to produce it, and it gives them a significant advantage when they're extending outside their borders. Comparative advantage what happens when it specializes in a product, but it can supply more efficiently or at a lower cost than other items. So they have that advantage. They can actually produce it like everybody else, but they do it in a far more efficient way and cheaper, quite frankly. Outsourcing is transferring your other tasks outside of your nation where supplies and labor are much more advantageous, meaning cost effective. The United States exports and imports goods. Sometimes we export more than we import, and which will give us a trading deficit. But the most important thing about trading, whether it be imports or exports, is being able to uh, offset the negative impact of a trade deficit. Try to find ways to bring value to your trade and make certain the flow of money in and out of the country is done in such a way that the organization and the nation as a whole can benefit. The United States obviously trades exports more than it imports, and we have been dealing with, I would say, for the past 10, 12 years, a trade deficit, and you can see the numbers here. Now, as we deal with different nations, we need to understand what really are the concerns that they have, in hopes that we could possibly expand our services to these countries. And we're dealing with China with their population concerns. So we'll still give, a lot of credibility to other nations, but we need to also understand the problems, that the difficulties that they face. It does present opportunities for organizations to come in and provide some solutions. But there are trade barriers. There's no way that you can actually do business in another nation without dealing with those barriers, and some of them are located here, economic barriers, but most of the time the barriers are more social or cultural barriers, which means that you have to truly understand the nature of the individual people who live in those areas and what types of things they will be exposed to. If you're dealing with a nation that is an Islamic nation, you'll have to consider, if you want to do business in that country, those types of cultural and social barriers that will prohibit you to sell certain items to certain people in certain ways. So it's all about getting educated about that nation and the parameters in which you are able to work. But you'll also have to deal with the legal barriers as well. There are some inroads that you're just going to have to go through to ensure that you are compliant with state law or with the federal government law, but also compliant with the nation, which can be complicated. Economic barrier are just that. They are more advanced or they're less advanced, and which means that these organizations or these companies can't always distribute their product to these nations simply because the nation doesn't have the means. And that's important in consideration. However, it's not always the low per capita income, but it also, these nations may not be advanced enough sufficiently well where it would be advantageous for your organization to come in and market their services. Now, if the infrastructure doesn't exist, there may very well be an opportunity for your organization to come in and create that infrastructure. But depending on the type of business that you're trying to expand, you have to consider the fact that there may very well be some infrastructure issues that need to be overcome before you tap into that market. Dealing with the economic barriers, that includes the exchange rate. The difference between the value of our currency, which is in the dollar, and currencies of other nations could very well be significant. That difference could very well be more advantageous for an organization to use your money, but for you to spend your US dollars, it may not be worth as much. And organizations have to consider that difference between the currency value. Laws may be in place that will prohibit an organization from going in and providing their services or product. So you'll have to understand the laws. So you would have to have someone living, working in that nation who understands thoroughly the laws that affect that nation and deal with those potential conflicts between your nation and the nations that you're trying to tap into. Countries may prohibit the currency that leaves their borders. They may put not allow foreigners from owning property. They may not honor U.S. laws, or they may not even force their own laws. These things have to be considered and have to be very well known and part of your plan if you decide to extend your organization outside of its nation's borders. Trade barriers, trade tariffs. The United States and other countries do have taxes that they levy on goods imported to the country. That's it's not a it's not a significant barrier depending on the organization and their willingness to pay those tariffs, because sometimes they pass those tariffs on to the consumer in the purchase price. But nevertheless, that needs to be considered. I don't believe there is any nation that will allow an import without some type of, of tax or tariff for those imports. Reshoring. There are also considerations with economic changes in the companies that allow their manufacturing operations to go to another nation or to come back to the United States. We are definitely shifting our emphasis on keeping the American workforce viable and um, very much a part of the process of delivering goods and services to U.S. citizens. And as such, reshoring has been another factor that's going to be moving. Instead of us taking all of our jobs and giving them over to China or other countries, we're actually now getting incentives through tax breaks and etc. to move those manufacturing and other jobs back to America. And again, this is all about maintaining a stable economy within its nation, and the advantage of having consumers buy products that are made in the country that they live in. And these are just other types of restrictions that exist, or embargo, which would be a prohibition of trading in another country. We've had situations like that with Cuba and other countries where we just were not on friendly terms, and that's something very, very significant. There may very well be a quota, meaning there's a limit to how much you can import of a specific unit. So these are the things that are very important, that need to be known if anyone wants to consider expanding their operations outside the U.S. Now, this is just one example of a tariff that the United States has posed on Chinese-made tires. So we ought to think about all the types of things that different administrations that come in would impose to that would restrict what you have been able to do in the past, but now not able to do, or do with significant fees or tariffs. Political barriers are very, very complex, and we will not go into much detail, but you have to understand the political environment in which you're trying to do business. Some countries may allow bribes, but in the United States they're not allowed. So there are some very, very complicated and very significant issues that have to be addressed when you're contemplating expanding your business to another country. Social and cultural barriers. This could very well be religion. It could be language. It could be this just customs that you might have to respect. In the case of Israel, they have a kosher environment, which if you want to be a restaurant owner and you want to have a kosher license, you have to be aware of those rules, that you can't have certain meats and dairy products prepared together. Certain products that you would want to provide to a consumer can't be provided, simply because their customs of their cultural customs, their religious customs may prohibit certain types of foods being prepared in a certain way. Again, you have to understand and have a very thorough knowledge and sensitivity to the cultural and social frameworks of an organization that you want to move into another country. Technology might be a barrier. With more and more technology being spread across the globe, this is not so much a very significant problem, but you need to be considered. The United States has a trade agreement with various organizations outside of the U.S., and we have other international trading rules. This allows us to work together to have a set of established rules and to deal with any international problems, trade problems that can be dealt with and being implemented on a systematic basis. Now, America has its NAFTA agreement, which includes the country listed here, and the European nations have a European Union, which they allow agreements among those nations, and the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation. They are another agreements. Again, these are alliances that allow free trade, dealing with the difference in currency, dealing with differences in different rules. It just allows these organizations within these different countries to transact business together with removing a good number of those barriers that have been created, tariffs, etc., as a result of them being outside of a specific nation. The chart here just shows the opportunity between nations and how much of their goods in terms of dollar amount they are actually exporting to other countries. Organizations have a vested interest in exploring the possibility of utilizing this service of moving their businesses outside. I mean, there sometimes becomes a time when your organization has grown sufficiently well, you've tapped the market, and it is basically saturated. And organizations are sometimes even pushed into moving globally simply to stay alive and to stay viable as an entity. But nevertheless, you need to understand all of the rules that's involved in moving your organization outside of its borders, all of the different barriers and loopholes that you'll have to deal with in the laws and the cultural customs that are familiar with that nation. Now, franchising does allow it to be a little easier to move into to different countries, but the barriers still remain. Cultural differences and societal changes and tariffs still exist. But what happens is it becomes more effective when franchises are able to customize their products to meet those needs of the consumers in that country, and removing products that will be socially unacceptable. So, in this chapter, I would say that what you'll need to know is going global is becoming more and more of a business decision. It is very much important for many organizations as they grow and expand to become global. With the advance of technology and the free trade agreements that it currently exist, globalization is most certainly something that's going to happen for many organizations, depending on how long they are around and the goods and services that they provide. Understanding the tariffs and all of the barriers that are involved with making the decision to expand your operations outside of the nation's borders are very important items to consider. Also, having an understanding of that culture, working with people who live in that culture and who are familiar with the laws and customs of that culture is imperative, simply because your organization must understand and be sensitive to those needs and those requirements in order to be successful in moving your business outside of the United States. Therefore, if you can use other organizations like Walmart, like the franchises and McDonald's, and understand what they had to go through, what types of things that they had to learn, and the rules that they were subject to, it will definitely give you an advantage if you ever consider moving outside of the United States. Microsoft and other organizations, IBM, the franchises of McDonald's, all of those organizations have been outside of the United States for many, many years, and they have established an extraordinary pathway along which many smaller organizations can walk through. They have been successful. They have been able to develop a strategy. They have expanded their operations and, in many ways, are quite successful, which I believe is a great opportunity for any organization to consider that globalization is going to be a part of just doing business. So as you continue to read through the chapter and going through the terminology in this particular chapter, consider that you'll be able to distinguish an absolute advantage and a comparative advantage. That you'll understand the role and what they mean as it relates to globalization. And then you can also talk about and think about what levels might a firm want to get involved in international business. Is it something they want to do right away? Is it something they may very well just wait and see how their organization can meet the needs of its current market? And what level of a commitment of resources that's needed to expand to another nation? And sometimes the question very well has a very simple answer. The answer is yes, but not right now. Or yes, and maybe we need to explore further. Or yes, we need to get investing because there may be a significant cost as it relates to making this big move. But at the end of the day, I think the more discussion is made about globalization, the more opportunities that are presented to you. You have many organizations that have been global for many years, and you can utilize their their strategy, and utilize their knowledge to make that very, very significant decision to move to another nation. This concludes chapter 3. And as you read through this chapter, I find that this is going to be a very, very important chapter simply because it is so important that people realize that companies are just not going to be stagnant within their nation. Globalization is an inherent part of doing business, and I think it's going to be more a, a question of not whether we're going to go outside of our nation, but when we're going to go outside of our nation. So as you think about your current company that you're working with or a company that you're trying to develop, don't lose sight of how important globalization will be with your business, either now or in the future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll talk to you in the next one.